type of book club. And I want to point out, here's the schedule for discussing the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration, and the age of colorblindness. So we'll meet once a month, the first Tuesday of the month at noon. So today we'll cover just introducing the book, and then chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6 on the next 3 sessions. So this slide, this is a public health framework for reducing health inequalities, and this is the Bay Area Regional Health Inequities, the BARHI. Actually, the first time I saw this was at the conference that is going to be tomorrow that Todd Moore is organizing and leading, the Heartland Health Equity Conference. So shout out to Todd. But I put this up last year when we started this book club because it felt a little bit like I needed to explain why it would be important for us at an academic medical center to be talking about racism. I don't think that it's that necessary anymore. I feel like we all understand why it's important to talk about it now, and it's kind of more in the front of all of our minds and kind of on our priority list. But I just want to touch on this again because it really does impact what we do at a medical center, whether we're researchers or healthcare professionals, or we're just involved in making the whole thing run so we can get students educated to become doctors. We spend most of our time here in this disease and injury, and maybe in the risk behaviors, and trying to, get people healthier so they have less health problems. And I think in like the last 10 years, these social determinants of health, which we really kind of talk about the living conditions. Those have been the common like social determinants of health, like food access, housing, transportation, and things like that. The researchers have done a good job of showing how these things are upstream of the risk behaviors, so we can't just spend all of our time on individual education, teaching people, because sometimes people don't have access to healthy food or a place to exercise or any of these number of things. But what we really need to be spending time now, research has shown, and others have shown, that there's something even further upstream, and that is really the structural determinants of health. And so this is where you tie in the social inequities and the institutional inequities, which directly play into living conditions and risk behavior and disease and injury. So this is where race plays a role. And so you have the political and economic structures that have been shaped by race and racism in our country, and how they have shaped institutions, and then how that trickles down to what we do, at an academic medical center. So I hope that is clear to everyone and makes sense to everyone. I think it probably does. This is as I was reading through the introduction, this really stood out to me, this quote from Michelle Alexander, the author of the book. And she said, "We have not faced our racial history and cannot tell the truth about our racial present." And so I think, if we think of our racial present as these disparities, so whether it's health disparities, economic disparities, educational opportunity disparities, whatever it is, we need to start speaking really honestly about how our racial history plays into our racial present, and to be speaking about it honestly and really taking a good look. So our role at KU Med, whatever role you play, wherever we are here, the whole inspiration for this book club was another conference where we had this candid panel discussion with some community members, and Hakima Payne, who's an African-American community member who runs Uzazi Village, she really spoke up and said, you need to do a better job at KU. And not specific to us, but that's who she was talking to as researchers or as healthcare professionals, to do the internal work of really this, understanding the racial history and understanding what that means for our racial present. So that inspired this book club, and this book club is meant to be an informal place for us to discuss, and it's just one piece of the pie. So there are, there's actual experts who will be leading lectures, like we have Dr. Jason Glenn from the History and Philosophy of Medicine department, who's leading some lectures on the history of policing and incarceration. I know I've heard Dr. Geraldine McGee say basically the same thing. Like, we really need to understand our history and how we got here. And I know that she has some programming planned, and there will be lots of other things. So this book club, this is just one piece of the pie. And this is a place for us to use the books as the experts. This is the expert material. There's a lot out there. And then we can practice talking about it, which is really the hard part, because we've taught that race talk is taboo, we're ill-equipped, and we don't have the skills really to talk about it. So this is a place for us to read these books together, break it down, and start talking about it. And so we have peer facilitators. We're not experts. Each of the 6 breakout groups, after I kind of finish the introduction, we'll go into 6 breakout rooms to practice talking. And we have peer facilitators there. So we're all learning together. And I want to acknowledge that this group is diverse in, the number of years or months or, however long people have been learning about this, or through lived experience. We all are on this spectrum, but that there's no endpoint. And so I also want to say, those of us who are newer to the journey, and those of us, we read White Fragility, and we kind of started to talk about what we need to do differently to be honest and open and do some self-reflection and talk about it. But there's so much more than that. That was just, a brief, opening point. And so if you are new to this, I encourage you to seek out additional support. There are other books you can read. There are lots of videos and TED Talks and different things online. There are groups, if you just Google I think, Kimberly, did your office put together that sort of toolkit that has resources, and one part of it is specifically for white people to look at, so please seek out the additional support that you need, because we are moving on to intense topics. And, this first one in mass incarceration. And so Hakima Payne, who was the inspiration for this book club, and she's been generously mentoring me through this process. And she gave a warning, she's like, this is very intense, and it can be traumatic for people of color to discuss these things, especially with white people. And if you haven't developed the skills to have these conversations, it can be sort of dangerous, and there's a risk of trauma and triggering with these conversations. So I just want to acknowledge that. And we will offer, Dr. Sparkman Barnes, are you on here?
Yes, I am on here.
I didn't see when I first started. So Dr. Sparkman Barnes will offer the Healing Space Zoom call in case there's any of you on here who would rather go into a Zoom call just for people of color to discuss this. Okay. So I will start talking about the book, and then we'll break out and have some time to do our small groups. So The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness is written by Michelle Alexander. She's a civil rights lawyer, legal scholar. She has been a law professor at Stanford in the past. She was previously the director of the Racial Justice Project for the ACLU of Northern California. And she published this book 10 years ago. And she says in the introduction that 10 years prior to that, when she was starting this job as the director of the Racial Justice Project for the ACLU, she remembers seeing this sign. It was just like an invitation to this sort of, grassroots activist group meeting, and it said, "Mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow." And she remembers seeing that and thinking, sure, there's racism inherent in all of our institutions. We all know that. We need to work on that, but that just seems really, like a conspiracy theory type language, and that's not, that's not helpful, or I forget exactly what she said. But then she says, over the next 10 years of doing the work that she did, she came to the exact same conclusion, that indeed there is a racial caste system inherent in the way that our country runs its incarceration system and correctional systems, and that she now believes that everyone needs to be aware that mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow. So she begins the introduction by discussing this legacy of racial exclusion, and that generations of Black men born in the US have been denied the right to participate in our electoral democracy. Jarvis Cotton cannot vote, she says. His great-great-grandfather could not vote because he was a slave. His great-grandfather was killed by the KKK for trying to vote. His grandfather didn't vote due to Klan intimidation. His father was barred from voting by poll taxes and literacy tests. And Jarvis Cotton cannot vote because he has been labeled a felon and is currently on parole. So the thesis, the central claim in this book is that we have not ended racial caste with the end of slavery or the end of Jim Crow in America, but we have merely redesigned it. In the book, she says, after the civil rights movement, it was no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as justification of discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. And so we use our criminal justice system to label people of color as criminals and then engage in all of the practices we supposedly left behind. Once labeled a felon, Americans are subject to legalized discrimination in employment, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, denial of educational opportunity, denial of public benefits, including food assistance, and exclusion from jury service. And so here I'm going to show some graphs to just sort of illustrate what mass incarceration in the United States looks like. The United States is the leader, has the highest rate of incarceration in all of the world. For every 100,000 people in the United States, 670, this is a 2016 statistic, that 670 are incarcerated. And so you compare that, you can just go down the list and look at all these other nations and what their rates of incarceration look like. At the time that she wrote The New Jim Crow, it was closer to 1,000 of every 100,000 in the United States were incarcerated. And so look at this next graph. This is as recent as 2015. And this shows you from 1925 throughout the years at the population, the federal, state and federal prison population. And you can see that there was a big jump right here in the late 70s, early 80s. And this was right about the time of the beginning of the war on drugs. So throughout this book, she describes how she and other scholars note that the war on drugs was really a major contributor to this huge prison boom. This is 2015, and as of now, federal, state, and local jail population is 2.3 million. And so why do we talk about this in terms of a racial caste system and racial disparities? And that's because if you look at the prison population, it's disproportionately people of color. African Americans are more likely than white Americans to be arrested, to be convicted once arrested, and to experience lengthy prison sentences once convicted. African American adults are 5.9 times as likely to be incarcerated than whites. And so you can look at this graph and it shows, you know, the US population is 64% white, but the prison population is 30% white. And the US population is 12% Black, but 33% of the prison population is Black. So there's a clear racial disparity. If you look now, you know, as I was looking for some current stats to show, there's all this language about how, you know, prison rates have actually been declining over the last decade, and imprisonment rates have declined across racial and ethnic groups. And so this is a Pew Research Center report showing that, you know, as of 2018, for every 100,000 Black adults in the US, 1,500 are incarcerated. And you can look, you know, compared to whites and Hispanics. But buried in the text of the report, you could see that if you just look at men, that the rates are actually more similar to how the overall rates used to be in 2006. So for every 100,000 Black men in the US, 2,272 are incarcerated. The rates for men when she wrote the book in 2010 were 4,000. For 100,000 men, 4,000 were incarcerated. So there is a decline, but it's still, I mean, it's coming down from such a major disparity there. Okay, so then she describes in the introduction that those of us who view mass incarceration from a comfortable distance tend to attribute the staggering increase in incarceration rates in communities of color to the predictable consequences of poverty, racial segregation, unequal educational opportunities, and presumed realities of the drug market, like the mistaken belief that most drug dealers are Black. So if the war on drugs made this huge prison boom and the majority, or there's this disproportionate amount of people of color, well, they must be committing all the crime, right? That would justify it. But if you look at the rates of drug use and sales by race, then you can see on the left here, between Blacks and whites, use drugs at similar rates, sell drugs at similar rates. But if you look on the right, drug-related arrests, the dark purple represents Black people in America, and that is much higher, much more likely to be arrested. And in the middle is drug-related incarceration at the state level, and then drug-related incarceration at the federal level. So you can see, though use and sales of drugs is the same, that at the state level, Blacks are about 6.5 times as likely as whites to be incarcerated for drug-related crimes. Okay. And so here is a pie chart looking at all of the population. So I mentioned before, there are 2.3 million people confined nationwide with state prisons, federal, and local jails included. And she points out that, you know, a lot of the criticism, I guess, of the book came primarily in that, you know, she's focusing on drug-related crime and nonviolent crime in the book, and that a lot of times people look at these pie charts and say, well, look at this, you know, violent crime. So if you look at state prisons, which makes up the majority of incarcerated individuals, that it looks like half of the people are there for violent crime. So how could the war on drugs have been, you know, responsible for this whole, you know, all these people being affected by mass incarceration? And so she points out, you know, she says, maybe this is, I have the 10th anniversary edition. So she has a new preface. And she says, you know, when she wrote the book and currently, most people sentenced to jail or prison have been convicted of nonviolent crimes. In fact, 95% of the 10 million yearly arrests are for nonviolent crimes. But when you take a snapshot like this, it looks different because this, you know, the violent crime sentences are longer. So those people are there for longer. And so you might look at, it looks like, you know, these nonviolent offenses, there are less people there, but they're for shorter time. So more people are cycling in and out than this would represent. You know, a snapshot doesn't show that if you looked at it over 10 years or 20 years, the number of people that would cycle through, you know, this smaller segment of the pie is larger than those that would move through here, if that makes sense. So snapshots of the prison population don't tell the whole story of the volume of people cycling in and out on shorter sentences for nonviolent crimes. And then she says in the book that it's really important that we're not just talking about the people currently locked up, because all of those, all of the ways that, you know, people can be discriminated against legally once convicted of a felon, or once, you know, under probation or on parole, all of that is affecting people who are no longer in prison. And so she wants to show here, or she, you know, she talks about incarceration is just one piece of the larger system. So 3.6 million people on probation, nearly 1 million people on parole, and then this is representing the other 2.3 million people who are currently incarcerated. And then mass incarceration directly impacts millions of people. So the 2.3 million incarcerated, 4.9 million formerly incarcerated, 19 million ever convicted of a felony, And 77 million people have a criminal record, and 113 million adults have an immediate family member who has been in prison or jail. And so most face collateral consequences even after their sentence ends, such as voting, housing, education, employment, and other restrictions. Okay, so we'll split up and have some time to talk over a few questions, but I do want to have us agree to some ground rules that we will honor confidentiality in our small groups, that we'll choose courage over comfort, and that we'll regard feedback as a generous gesture that should always be met with gratitude within these discussions. And if you are a person of color and you'd rather go into the healing space Zoom call, you can choose to do that. And Alexa will divide us up into our groups.
What time are we coming back at? I just wanted to confirm.
12:50.
12:50.
Okay. Oh, wait, before you break us up,
Yes.
I'm sorry, I want to just stop sharing. I didn't know if, is Dr. Jason Glenn on here or not? Okay, I don't think so. Okay, ready.